joining us today as we review the findings of the Alliance for a Just Society's new report, Low Wage Nation. This report paints a sobering, though sadly unsurprising picture of just how hard it is for job seekers to find a job that pays enough for a full-time worker to make ends meet. Nationwide, there are long lines of job seekers for each job that pays a living wage, and the economy on its own isn't producing new jobs to alleviate the crisis. We're going to examine policy solutions to address multiple aspects of this crisis and hear about work that groups are doing to win real improvements for the lives of the millions of people in America who are struggling in this low-wage nation. Our speakers today include Allyson, Fredericksen, and Ben Henry of the Alliance for a Just Society. They are the report's researchers and authors. We'll also hear from LeRoy, the Executive Director of Good Jobs First, and Pittz, the Executive Director of Washington Community Action Network. And before we dive in, I want to give folks a heads up on asking questions. So you should have on your screen a Q&A box, so you can enter questions at any time, starting now. If there are questions that you are particularly interested in hearing the answer to, you can press the little plus button, and that will bump them to the top of the queue. And then we'll be taking questions during the whole presentation, and we will circle back at the end to answer your questions. So, as I said, we are the Alliance for a Just Society, and the Alliance is a national network of 15 racial and economic justice organizations working to create a progressive infrastructure capable of meeting 21st century challenges to the American dream of liberty and justice for all. We provide organizing and policy support for our affiliates and for partners, and we execute local, state, and national campaigns and work to build strong affiliate organizations and partnerships that really promote economic, racial, and social justice. So today we're releasing the Low Wage Nation, which is the most recent in the series of the Alliance's Job Gap Economic Prosperity series, which really examines the ability of working families to make ends meet. How can families move beyond living paycheck to paycheck in today's economy? What are the policy solutions that decision makers can implement that will really begin to address the reality of today's broken economy and low-wage nation? This is the third in this year's series. So Last year we released initially Families Out of Balance, which really examined what a living wage is for families. How much does it really take for families of a variety of family sizes to make ends meet? We then dug deeper into the gender and race disparities that we see in who is actually able to find those jobs to make ends meet. Unsurprisingly, there are stark disparities in along race and gender lines in terms of who is able to, or who is working jobs that make ends meet. And then today, the most recent report really examines what jobs are available to folks, what are those job openings, and how many people are fighting for that one elusive position that enables them to make ends meet for a full-time job. So before we dive into the research, I want to make it clear that this report isn't just about the numbers. The data we're releasing today shouldn't obscure the fact that we're talking about real people's lives. Our report does include personal stories of families trying to make it in our low-wage nation. Here are a couple of quotes from folks. We have a woman from Orlando, Florida, who rightfully points out it's very hard to call a job a career if you're not getting paid enough to make ends meet. Mm-hmm. And then a mother from Queens, New York, who really details the impacts that her struggling to find a living wage job is having on her children. So this is a very high stakes conversation with very real and personal impacts. So I am going to, well, first I'm going to encourage everyone to go to thejobgap.org and actually look at the report and see the personal stories. We all know people in our lives who are struggling to make ends meet, and I really don't want that to get lost in the conversation about numbers. Though that being said, I do want to turn the webinar over now to Ben Henry and Allyson Fredericksen, who are the report's researchers and authors. Ben?
Thanks, Jill. Hello, webinar land. My name is Ben Henry. I'm Senior Policy Associate at the Alliance. So the question is, what is the low-wage nation? Unless you live in a cave, you've been hearing a lot of talk about economic recovery and falling unemployment rates. But what the data shows us is that masks a much more nuanced story. So the Bureau of Labor Statistics has calculated that in 2012, there were 10.6 million working poor, or those living in poverty despite holding down a job. But poverty is an antiquated way to measure access to prosperity. The reality is that there is a much higher number of people, of working people, who aren't making ends meet. And that's if you have a job. The unemployment rate you keep hearing about at 5.6% does not include the underemployed and those who have been discouraged from looking for work. Actually, a truer measure of unemployment, which includes those individuals, was 12%, not 5.6, in 2014. And there are much more people unemployed than since the beginning of the Great Recession in 2007, when that unemployment rate was just 8.3%. So that rate peaked at 16.7% in 2010. So yes, it has dropped since that peak. But it is very important to note that job growth has come mostly in low-wage industries. So these new jobs we keep hearing about, the reality is they don't actually provide enough to meet basic needs. And so that reality, that we are living in a low-wage nation, a country of workers putting in long hours but still failing to make ends meet, that is what workers are facing. And here is the evidence. Allyson?
Thanks, Ben. Again, my name is Allyson Fredericksen, and I'm a policy associate here at the Alliance. And before we get into the report's findings, we want to go over a few definitions that we use in our report. And for full details on these terms and on our findings, again, you can refer to our full report that's available at thejobgap.org. First off, what is a living wage? We talk about making ends meet, but what does that really mean? We define a living wage as an hourly wage high enough to allow a full-time worker to support herself and her family without requiring her to be on public assistance and to allow her to provide for her family's needs. A living wage is not a poverty wage, and it's not simply scraping by. However, it is still a modest wage that includes only the basic necessities, a little bit of extra for miscellaneous items like clothes and toiletries, and a small amount for savings and emergencies. This wage allows working families to move beyond living paycheck to paycheck, but it still assumes fairly frugal living. A living wage varies by location and by family size, depending on factors such as the cost of housing or the cost of childcare. Another term that we use in our reports is the job gap ratio. This ratio shows us whether there are enough jobs at a certain wage level to go around. We define job seekers not only as those in the official unemployment rate, but also involuntary part-time workers and marginally attached workers. And we use the median wage of occupations with job openings to determine whether those openings pay a given wage level. The ratio of job seekers to the number of job openings at a given wage level is what we call the job gap.
So in our study, we examined projected employment, or how government agency data sets expect jobs to grow by occupation. And using living wages that we calculated in a previous report, we determine how many of those projected new jobs will pay enough for workers to make ends meet. This we see is a true measure of workers' ability to provide for themselves and their families. So we looked at living wages in about 10 states because that's where we had the data. In Low Wage Nation, we also took an alternate view of these projected jobs. For the rest of the country, we examined how many projected jobs pay $15 an hour or better. So we use 15 to represent a living wage for comparison purposes. There has been a lot of momentum in the movement for 15. You'll hear more about that from Will Pittz, with Seattle and San Francisco enacting a $15 minimum wage. Ultimately, we view 15 actually as a conservative estimate of a living wage. For instance, in our calculations, the living wage for a single adult actually exceeds $15 in 8 out of the 10 states studied, and it was nearly 15 in the other 2 states, Montana and Idaho. So calling 15 conservative might seem counterintuitive given a federal minimum wage at $7.25 that is less than half of 15. But note that that number hasn't increased since 2009. That means 6 years of pay cuts to the minimum wage worker in real dollars. And adjusted for inflation, the federal wage floor is lower today than it was in 1968. That's 47 years. And looking at the tip minimum wage, or the minimum restaurant servers are paid, for instance, at a paltry $2.13 an hour, it hasn't increased since 1991. So that's back when grunge was a thing. Police were caught on tape beating Rodney King, and Bush Sr. was president. 15 might seem like a lot, but it actually doesn't go far enough.
So the question that we're really asking in this report is, are there enough good-paying jobs to go around? As we've already hinted at, there just aren't. This table shows us the total number of job openings in each state and nationally, and the percentage of openings that pay less than $15 per hour in each state and nationwide. This table is also in our report if anyone would like to review it further. As Ben mentioned, we're using $15 as a proxy for a living wage job for a single adult here to compare states and to get a good estimate nationally. In looking at the percentage of job openings that pay less than $15 per hour nationally, we find that 2.4 million out of 5 million total projected jobs, or about 48%, are expected to pay less than $15 an hour. That means that nearly half of all job openings are not paying enough for a single adult to make ends meet, let alone enough for a parent with children. This is also higher than the proportion of existing jobs that pay less than $15 per hour, showing that new jobs are more likely to be low wage and signifying a shift to a low wage workforce. At the state level, we find that there are 25 states where more than half of job openings are low wage, paying less than $15 per hour. And there are no states where fewer than 1/3 of job openings are in low-wage occupations.
We also find that workers seeking better wages have few options. Nationally, in 2013, for every job opening that paid above the low-wage threshold of 15, there were 7 job seekers. So that's right, 7. That means there are 7 times more people looking for a decent-paying job than there are good-paying jobs to be had. This is a national job gap. It demonstrates both how crowded the job market is for employment that pays above poverty wages and how few of those jobs actually exist. So it's not as easy for a low-wage worker as just, finding another job. The jobs aren't out there, and there is stiff competition for the few that are. And let's talk a little more about those people looking for work. Our friends at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities calculated for us the number of individuals looking for work, the unemployed, the underemployed, discouraged workers. We find that there were 19.6 million job seekers in 2013. Now that is one crowded waiting room, and that is nearly double the number of job seekers in 2007 before the recession. So with a projection of only 2.6 million job openings that pay better than 15, there are 17 million more job seekers than openings that pay above that low wage threshold. These job seekers are left to either find low wage or non-sustaining jobs or not work at all. Now, importantly, this discussion is all for a $15 wage, a rough representation of a living wage for a single adult. For parents with children, however, the situation can be very different. Idaho, for example, has a living wage of $14.75 14.57 for a single adult, with a job gap of 8 job seekers for each job opening that pays that wage. Idaho's living wage for a single adult with 2 children, though, is $25.12 an hour. Those childcare costs add up. And that's a wage that has 21 job seekers for each opening at that level, with 83% of openings in Idaho paying less than that wage.
So why is there such a significant job gap? We've all heard news about how the economy is rebounding, but the problem is the kinds of jobs that are being created are not the same ones that we've lost. Instead, job creation is happening in low-wage occupations like retail salespersons that don't pay enough for workers to make ends meet. In fact, among the top 10 occupations with the most projected job openings, just one, registered nurses, has a median wage greater than $15 an hour. The top 4 are in retail and food service, with median wages ranging between $8.81 to $10.16 per hour, well below our low-wage threshold of $15 an hour. Further, 2 of those occupations with the most projected openings are actually among the nation's 10 lowest paying occupations, including combined food preparation and serving workers, including fast food, which is actually the lowest paying occupation out of all occupations with wage data. It's also important to note that these low wages disproportionately impact people of color, as the restaurant industry is the single largest employer of people of color and the second largest employer of immigrants in the country. Even outside of the restaurant industry, people of color are more likely to work in occupations that pay low wages, leaving them with little ability to make ends meet for themselves and their families.
Now, on the other hand, we see that healthcare industries continue to see job growth, are proven to weather recessions and provide tangible benefits to working families beyond even jobs. With the advent of the Affordable Care Act, or commonly known as Obamacare, health insurance was made affordable and even free to millions of families across the country. While some states have yet to implement the expansion of Medicaid, nearly every state has seen an increase in the number of individuals insured. This has created a greater demand that must be met by increasing the number of healthcare practitioners and support occupations to ensure that families are well served by their new health insurance. If we invest in our healthcare system, that generates demand. That increased demand generates the need for increased supply. That is how you create jobs. And not just any jobs, living wage jobs. The weighted average of all healthcare occupations, the wage, is $28.43. And of all 78 healthcare occupations defined by the BLS, just 14 have a minimum wage of a median wage of less than $15. These are good paying jobs. And that's just the direct impacts of investments in healthcare. There are indirect benefits as well, as these new jobs would lead to more people to be able to take their family out to dinner, which would then benefit that restaurant. So quite simply, our findings show that this is an industry worth investing in. And it's a wise investment, not just because of its wages. It also provides economic stability. We see that healthcare jobs are recession-proof, as these industries experience the largest growth in jobs among all industries during the Great Recessions. They actually grew during the recession. So while Jill will cover our recommendations in a minute, investing in industries like healthcare that pay higher wages and weathers recessions will help make more living wage jobs available to workers.
Thank you, Ben and Allyson. We're now going to go to Greg LeRoy, who's the Executive Director of Good Jobs First. Good Jobs First is a national policy resource center for grassroots groups and public officials promoting corporate and government accountability in economic development and smart growth for working families. He's going to discuss Ben pointed to investing in job creation, and there are good ways to do that, and there are ways that don't really quite meet the needs of communities. So Greg is going to discuss with us economic development and job creation. Greg?
Thanks very much, Jill, and I'm pleased to be with the Alliance today, and I salute them for the job gap study. This is a great service being provided. So go to the next slide, please. We focus on what are sometimes called business incentives. We use the term job subsidies as well, but if you look at the next slide, you'll see all forms of state and local spending for economic development for job creation tallies about $70 billion a year. That's the best guess estimate we can give you for all these different kinds of economic development incentive or subsidy programs. That's the universe of programs that I want to talk about for a second. Next slide. So the good news is lots more states are disclosing online which companies are getting tax breaks and other kinds of economic development incentives. We've gone from only 23 states, these states in green, disclosing in 2007 to, next slide, 37 states disclosing 3 years later in 2010 to the next slide, to today where I don't know what the matter is with Kansas, Idaho, and Delaware. They're the last 3 states that aren't disclosing any company-specific data online, although we have a lot of that information in our own subsidy tracker. The District of Columbia is also green in this map too. It's disclosing now too. But just because states are telling us where the money's going doesn't mean they're telling us what's happening. And in the red states in this map, we're not getting outcome information. That is, we're not getting information about jobs created or wages paid. We can tell you how much money is getting spent, and we can usually tell you which companies are getting the biggest subsidy packages, and maybe sometimes a press release about what is supposed to come out of the deals, but we can't tell you the actual outcomes. In fact, if you look at the next slide, summarizing a study we published called Show Us the Subsidized Jobs, which we published in January a year ago, 3 out of 4 of the major state incentive programs that we looked at do not disclose actual jobs created. And only 1 out of 11, about 9%, tell you actual wages paid by the companies getting the tax breaks. So you can see that study at our website, goodjobsfirst.org. You know the next slide? At the local level, things are a little more primitive still. We did a survey about a year and a half ago, looking at big cities and big counties. And you'll notice in the second bullet there that there are lots of big counties and big cities in this country that still don't even have their own major local economic development subsidy programs online. Although certainly there are some places, Memphis, New York, Austin, Texas, and Chicago, that have excellent disclosure with lots of information online about who's getting the money and what's coming of the deals. So it can be done, and there's certainly lots of best practices, and all of that information, again, is captured in our subsidy tracker. Next slide. So the solution here, obviously, are attaching strings to the deals, what we call job quality standards. And we refer to market-based wage standards. That is, median wages like those that were discussed in healthcare or construction or manufacturing as the best kind of wages. We don't want to see job quality standards attached to the minimum wage or to the poverty rate. Those are not good enough. They don't achieve the kinds of goals we're talking about today of helping people not be dependent anymore on social safety net programs. So if you look at a study we published in 2011 called Money for Something, you can see our summary of how well states and cities are requiring job creation and wages and healthcare and other things like that. The argument here, obviously, from an economic development point of view, is to say we as taxpayers should not be worried about having hidden taxpayer costs associated with deals. That is, we shouldn't be subsidizing Walmart quality jobs, for instance, where we know that a lot of people will be dependent on Medicaid or state children's health insurance or food stamps or heating assistance or things like that. Next slide. And that's our discussion for today. Thanks so much for letting me be with you. And again, the point here is that states and cities, if they're going to invest $70 billion a year, should be very mindful of the Alliance's findings today about the quality of jobs being created, because it really matters.
Thanks, Greg. Yeah, and on that note, in terms of job quality, we're going to next hear from Will Pittz, he's the executive director of Washington Community Action Network, actually one of the Alliance for a Just Society's affiliates, along with One America in Washington State, who worked hard in Seattle on the Fight for 15. So he's going to discuss what that successful fight looked like and how they were able to make the significant change in for the lives of low-wage workers in Seattle.
Hi, thanks everybody. My name is Will Pittz, and thanks for the introduction, Jill. Washington CAN is a multi-issue grassroots organization, and we get involved in a range of issues related to poverty and injustice. We have 44,000 members across the state who come together to take collective action on everything from healthcare to jobs to criminal justice reform. And the people who are most active in our organization come to us because they're struggling in some significant way. Often they lack health coverage or affordable housing. They may be fighting against collection agencies because of a medical emergency or a predatory loan that put them in debt. They may just be struggling financially. And one of these members is Pina Belgrano. And Pina now lives in Seattle's Beacon Hill neighborhood in a home she bought in 2006. And I'm going to tell her story because it really illustrates some of the shifts in the economy that have been described by Allyson and Ben. Pina, in 2006, had a job in a real estate firm. But when the economy tanked, she, like most of her coworkers, were laid off. And when we met Pina, she was still getting up every day, and she was going to work at a hotel. She was making $11 an hour. She was doing everything she could to get by. But one thing that she couldn't do was continue to afford the mortgage on her home. And everyone, I think, at this point knows what happened to millions of people before the housing bubble. They were lured by banks into subprime loans that are now impossible to pay off. And Pina, like many others, was pushed to the brink of foreclosure. And, you know, those of us who work in community organizing have seen how savvy and resourceful people can be when their backs are against the wall. And Pina is no exception. She's worked every job she can find, all for minimum wage or close to it. She's a home care provider for the elderly. She worked in a cafe. She went back to school to get a degree in hospitality so she could become a hotel concierge. And when she wasn't working, she was hustling to find a loan modification. She had to ask her own daughter to move out of her home so that she could rent her room to help pay that mortgage. And it was a hard time for Pina and her family. But one afternoon she called us and she was elated because she had found a loan modification that would let her stay in her home, that it would lower her mortgage payment to something that she could manage. But just as her spirits were lifting, she went through the paperwork. She found out that her salary was 20% too low to qualify for that loan. The salary that she needed to make to qualify was $15 an hour. I tell that story to illustrate how raising the minimum wage has ripple effects that can uplift entire communities and the entire economy. A $15 an hour minimum wage means that people can afford school clothes or healthier food or to take their family to a movie. Maybe it even means they can stay in their home. When we thought about building this movement for 15 in Seattle, it started by talking to workers like Pina. We talked to hundreds of workers all across the city. And at first, people didn't even think 15 was possible, but people kept fighting because they had nothing to lose. So we built locally. And as we built the campaign and we built the base of workers, we realized that we needed to go bigger, and we started to organize small business owners. We knew that small business owners would be a sympathetic opposition to the campaign. But we helped small business owners understand that a $15 minimum wage for the city might actually help their business thrive and grow. We went through their books with them. We talked to their financial people. We looked at expenses. We did projections. We showed research on how consumer spending rises as income rises and made projections of anticipated business growth in the economy. We know that people with money in their pockets tend to spend it locally. And in the end, small business leaders stood with the mayor and stood with workers, calling for a $15 minimum wage in Seattle. The reason that's important is because we were fighting against a narrative that has been the dominant narrative in this country about jobs, which is that tax cuts for the wealthy and for corporations is what creates jobs. And we were trying to create a new narrative, that a bottom-up economy, one in which higher wages for lowest wage earners will actually help small businesses and help grow the entire economy. We know that the years of trickle-down economics have been a failure, especially for working people and also for the economy as a whole, so we addressed that narrative head-on. We also built the broadest coalition that we could. Faith leaders, community organizations, labor unions, as well as some critical small business voices to show broad support for the passage of 15. All of those pieces were critical to final passage. And I just want to say that we didn't start with a $15 campaign in Seattle. This was building on work that happened to pass a paid sick leave ordinance in the city that brought workers and community members and small businesses together, and a campaign in the small town of SeaTac south of Seattle to win $15 an hour. And just like Seattle was the campaign in Seattle and the $15 victory came on that foundation, we think the $15 victory in Seattle is a foundation for much bigger victories, both statewide and around the country. We've seen minimum wage increases in states from Massachusetts to we see it in San Francisco, and this is a movement that we think needs to continue to grow so that we can make sure that the jobs that we do have, we need to create those new good jobs. We need to make sure the jobs we do have are good jobs.
Thanks, Will. And thank you again to Allyson, Ben, and Greg for your presentation. So I just want to reiterate, so we live in a low-wage nation. Nearly 2 of 5 jobs, existing jobs, pay less than $15 an hour, and close to half of new jobs do not pay $15 or higher. There are 7 job seekers for every 1 job that pays $15 an hour. So this is a crisis, but again, it's not just about those numbers, it's not just about statistics, it's about Pina, it's about Rhonda, it's about Gladys, it's about the people in our communities who really are struggling to make ends meet and to provide for themselves and for their families and to really grow strong communities and a strong economy for this country. So there are some solutions. There are some policy recommendations that need to be acted upon immediately to alleviate this crisis. So you can see here, we need to be investing in industries that offer a pathway to living wages. We need to be thoughtful about these investments. We need to make sure that both government and corporations are accountable to the investments that we make with public dollars, and that those are going towards jobs that pay a living wage. We need to increase minimum wages to help workers across all industries. So in Seattle and San Francisco, there is a movement that's really gaining energy to lift that wage floor, and we need to continue that fight to make sure that workers are making enough to make ends meet. We need to make sure that is extended to all workers. We need to eliminate the tipped minimum wage. We need one wage. It simply is not okay to have an entire industry or industries of people who who it is okay to pay $2.30 an hour. That is simply not okay. Everyone needs to have the same just wage floor. We need to continue to continue the fight for work supports like paid sick days and paid maternity leave. This is another area where we're seeing groups making a lot of headway. So Seattle is another example, Portland, cities in New Jersey, New York City. People are beginning to really to make headway, and I apologize, there is a phone ringing in my office. We need to also strengthen safety net programs and work support. So in the absence, the reality is that right now people are working jobs that are being paid low wages, and we need to make sure that programs such as food stamps, Medicaid, child care subsidies, that those programs remain strong and actually see further investments. So when a person is not making enough to make ends meet, they have a safety net to rely on. And then we also need to make sure that there is a progressive tax structure in states and nationally, that everyone is paying their fair share, including corporations, so that we have enough federal and state revenue for investments in jobs, investments in those safety net programs that really make sure that make it possible for families to live with dignity in the absence of jobs that pay a living wage. So I just want to close by saying, for working families, jobs pay the bills, or at least that's how it's supposed to work. But the reality facing workers is clear. America is becoming a low-wage nation, and without action, the living wage crisis will only continue to worsen. Thank you all for joining today. I've been told that the Q&A function isn't working, but that folks could put questions on the event wall if folks have questions of any of our speakers today. We still have Allyson, Fredericksen, Ben Henry, and Will Pittz with us if people have any questions. I believe we do not have any questions now. So, Libero, is that true? Still no questions? Okay, well, I want to thank everyone, our speakers, but then also the folks who joined us today, and really just encourage folks to go to thejobgap.org to read the report, but more importantly, to use the report, to educate decision makers, to educate allies, to bring in folks into these fights, to continue the momentum for campaigns to raise wages, to increase job quality, and to really to promote an economy that puts families first, and that that will enable us to end the crisis of the low-wage nation and get back to a place where we have an economy where everyone has an opportunity to be prosperous. Thank you.